For those of you who don't know, my name is Michael Granado, of course, and today I'm going to be making a short, rather informal video talking about Jordan Peterson's views on science and religion. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm a history and philosophy educator, and my background is focused on an area of history and philosophy, the history and philosophy of science. There's a lot of overlap between those. So I'm going to respond to what Peterson has to say about the relationship between science and religion, and also some comments that he makes on the history of science in general. Got some short clips I'm going to play. That being said, if you come across a history of science video that you would like for me to respond to, please feel free to leave that in the comment section or email it to me as well. I really like doing this sort of thing, and of course it gives me something to talk about. And also, for those of you who don't know, Jordan Peterson is I guess we would call him a public intellectual nowadays, speaks on all sort of different topics. Although his background is in clinical psychology, he's going to talk a lot about religion, the nature of religion, and also implicitly he's going to talk a lot about philosophy and science as well. I will be critiquing most of the stuff that Peterson says in these videos, largely because there's not much that I agree with Peterson on, but also primarily because these ideas that he's going to be expressing are ideas that I hear commonly expressed online. So I think this will be a good chance to, in an informal way, talk about those thoughts. But enough about me. Let's hear from Dr. Peterson himself.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. It's true in that it provides the basis for truth itself. And so it's like a meta-truth. Without it, there couldn't even be the possibility of truth.
Okay, so already we're jumping into it here. And part of the reason why I chose this clip is because it highlights the importance of philosophy, even within conversation about history, because there's a common word that Peterson is using several times here: truth. And anytime we get into a discussion like this, it is incredibly important for us to define our terms so that way our audience knows exactly what we mean by this word, which is, of course, something that Peterson does not do. Now, granted, we're examining a very short clip, a YouTube short here, but even in the lecture itself that this is taken from, there's no real straightforward definition given for what exactly he's referring to when he talks about truth here. And this is going to create a fundamental problem, because from here he's going to go on to talk about the relationship of truth to the Bible. And of course, if we're not exactly sure what he means by truth, it's going to be very difficult to critique what he's saying there in terms of that relationship. But let's continue.
And so maybe that's the most true thing. The most true thing isn't some truth per se. It's that which provides the precondition for all judgments of truth. I can't see any holes in that argument. And I can't see any holes in it from a scientific perspective either, because I think we do know well enough now as scientists that the problem of deriving ethical direction from...
So without the Bible, there wouldn't even be the possibility of truth. Now, again, the problem here is primarily stemming from the fact that he hasn't defined truth. But even within this, within philosophy, within the branch of philosophy called epistemology, there are certain theories of truth. And the question of the nature of truth is one of those questions in philosophy that goes all the way back to the beginning. It's kind of like the question, what is the meaning of life? This is a question that philosophy has wrestled with since its inception throughout the ancient world. And partly why this is confusing is that there are major theories of truth that have developed over the centuries. Without a doubt, the most popular of which is an idea called the correspondence theory of truth. And very simply put, the correspondence theory of truth says that something is true, a statement is true, if that statement corresponds to reality. So let's use a really simple example. Take the statement, "There is a pen in my shirt pocket." Is that statement true? Well, the correspondence theory of truth says that statement would be true if it corresponds to empirical reality in this case, because that is a claim about empirical reality. And as a matter of fact, there is a pen in my shirt pocket. So yes, that statement is true. And this is where the problem lies, because empirical statements can be verified, and it's the verification that typically, when we talk about the truthfulness of the statement, that makes the statement true. And as far as I'm aware, the Bible's not making any claims to a correspondence theory of truth in that sense. And in terms of empirical truth, we wouldn't need any sort of metaphysical supposition there in order to verify that. Now, maybe Peterson's talking about like existential truth or truth about the nature of a spiritual reality that may supersede a physical reality. But regardless, there are theories of truths that may not fit within a strictly biblical context in that regard. So it's a little confusing. And even more confusing here is he's going to talk about some ethical assumptions and ethical ideas and how they are not derived from science.
From the collection of facts is an intractable problem. There's too many facts. There's an infinite number of facts. They do not provide an unerring guide for action. They can't. There's too many of them. They have to be prioritized. And as soon as they are prioritized, well, then you're in the ethical domain.
So we jump from truth to the Bible, from the Bible to science, and now from science to ethics. And the idea that ethics can't be derived from science is not necessarily a controversial one. I think that there would be a lot of philosophers who would agree with Peterson there. To a certain extent, I mean, again, it's difficult to judge what exactly he's saying about ethics. But to push back a little bit, there are certain ethical assumptions that science operates on, just like there are certain metaphysical assumptions that science operates on. Now, what I mean by that, for example, there's a famous philosopher of science named Daniel Dennett who once said that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. And what Dennett meant by that is there are some basic ideas and concepts that science assumes but doesn't really feel the need to prove. And these concepts can be metaphysical or ethical in nature. So the most common or base level epistemological assumption, metaphysical assumption that science makes is that there is a mind-independent reality outside of us. You're not going to go to a physics conference and hear a group of physicists sitting around a table arguing about whether or not reality exists or reality exists outside of our heads. Maybe you will. Physicists are kind of weird, but let's say a biology conference, right? This is an assumption that's made. It's an assumption that's necessary in order to do science. Likewise, we could also argue that there are certain ethical assumptions within science. A very prominent, non-controversial example of this would be the idea of openness, that openness within a scientific academic setting is a good thing, in the sense that we want to share our findings and our informations with each other in order for science to progress. That's an ethical assumption. But in both metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and this is where I might slightly agree with Peterson, it's very difficult to derive ethics from science per se. In other words, it's going to be very difficult to look at, for example, quantum mechanics and derive any sort of ethical principles. Now, quantum mechanics might have something to say about metaphysics, right? About what exists and what doesn't exist. Obviously, a lot of the natural sciences do, but with ethics, it's going to be difficult. And I'm also a little confused about where exactly Peterson is going with that, but I'll leave it there and we'll proceed to the next video.
The Judeo-Christian tradition established the monasteries. For example, the universities grew out of monasteries.
Okay, already I'm going to take some issue here. Already we need some clarifications. Now, Christianity does have a monastic tradition, but there are other religious traditions that also have monastic schools and monastic traditions. Specifically, the Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And I bring that up not to nitpick for historical reasons, although I am nitpicking for historical reasons, but also because the views that Peterson is going to express here are very Eurocentric, meaning that they are almost exclusively focused on European history. Now, if you want to limit your scope to the study of European history for your own purposes, for like a methodological reason, there's no inherent problem with that. The problem arises is when you start to derive philosophical or historical points and to make certain types of arguments based only on that history while ignoring the history of the rest of the world. You have a very limited selection there. And Peterson ought to know this, especially being a psychologist, that with a selective sample size, you're going to get selective results. And by excluding other possibilities and by excluding other data, we've created a sort of implicit bias in the argument that we're making. And the implicit bias here is Eurocentrism. But I think you'll kind of get what I mean in the latter part of this. So let's continue.
Scientific tradition grew out of the universities. The scientific project is actually embedded in the Judeo-Christian project. And the reason for that is the Judeo-Christian project is predicated on the Greek idea that there's a logos in the world and the Jerusalem idea that there's a logos in the intellect. And all of that's a precondition for.
Okay, so this is exactly what I mean. The claim that the scientific tradition is embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition is a statement that is partially true. Yes, modern European science grew out of European traditions and European religions, in this case, the Judeo-Christian tradition. Not to say that Christianity is inherently a European religion, it comes from the Middle East, but that modern European science developed in that context. We're talking about European Christianity, specifically in the monastic tradition within Europe. But hopefully you can already see the issue with that statement. Yes, that is true. And again, we're using this word true. It's true in a certain sense, but not in the sense that Peterson wants to claim, primarily because most of this hinges upon what exactly we mean by science. Because science is a systematic body of knowledge that's passed down from one generation to the next, a body of knowledge about the natural world, is not exclusive to Europe. In fact, science as such has appeared across the globe in almost every geographical region, in almost every ancient civilization that we know of. We have some form of science. And as a result, to say that science specifically grew out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, well, historically, that's just not true. There are other traditions which science has grown out of, such as science has come in the Hindu tradition. For example, for a period of about 400 or 500 years during the Gupta Empire, there is a tremendous body of astronomical, medical, and agricultural knowledge in Indian civilization. The same is true, for example, in Islamic civilization during an 800-year period known as the Islamic Golden Age. And Peterson himself mentions the ancient Greek tradition here. The ancient Greeks were not, of course, Jews or Christians. That's not to say that there was no influence by Judaism and Christianity. Of course there was, but to frame it as if the Judeo-Christian tradition is the only tradition that influenced the rise of modern science is a very historically short-sighted view. But let's let Peterson continue.
Science, and if we lose God, we'll lose science too. And I think that's what's happened.
Yeah,
I think that the new atheists, because I think the historical notion that there is an antagonism between science and religion is actually a misreading of history. I don't think that is how it laid itself out. And I do believe that the scientific enterprise is embedded in the broader Judeo-Christian narrative.
Now, certain aspects of what Peterson just said there is partially correct. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there is a very popular reading of the history of science known as the conflict thesis, which were developed by two early historians known as Draper and White. And this is the idea that the history of science and religion, the relationship between the two, has been a history of conflict, and that science as a discipline, science as an institution is constantly being threatened by religion, or is constantly kind of contradicting religious ideas and religious claims to authority. A prime example of this that people like to draw from, of course, is the trial of Galileo, who was convicted of heresy. You can also look at the debates surrounding the teaching of evolution in public schools in the United States in the early 20th century. All of this is used as data to suggest that science and religion are sort of inherently at odds or inherently oppose one another. Now, Peterson is right in the sense that this narrative of the history of science has been rejected across the board by historians of science over the past 50 years or so. Peterson's not the first person to know this. Ask any modern historian of science that deals with the history of religion and science, and they're going to tell you the same thing. The conflict thesis is the essential problem with the conflict thesis is the problem with every grand historical narrative. And that's the problem of you can always find counterexamples. Now, in the case of the conflict thesis, you're going to find hundreds of counterexamples. So it's not just an isolated thing. There are numerous examples of not conflict, but even the opposite of religious traditions and religious institutions helping and promoting scientific development. So the conflict thesis has largely been rejected. But just because the conflict thesis has been rejected, just because historians of science deny that there's inherent opposition between science and religion, doesn't mean that we can move on to make the next step, the next sort of claim that Peterson is making, that science itself arose explicitly out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's a historical claim that we don't have a lot of evidence for. And again, we have the opposite sort of evidence due to the fact that we have scientific traditions arising from other non-Christian, non-Jewish sources and places throughout history. And I want to be extremely clear here. That is not to say that that the Judeo-Christian tradition didn't influence the development of modern science. It most certainly did, without a doubt. But there are other things which influence the development of modern science, specifically the Islamic tradition, and that's something that's almost always left out of these sorts of conversations. And even on top of that, religion is not the only influence on the development of modern science. Philosophy also tremendously helped the development of modern science. Mathematics, for example, the connection between mathematics and the natural sciences was not something that was always evident to a lot of people. This is actually I would say that's one of the bigger influences there. You can see this in the early letters of Copernicus, the debate that happens between Kepler and Ursus, the letters that Galileo is writing. A big part of that debate is the linking of mathematics to science. And another more practical thing that's going to lead to the development of modern science is, of course, money and funding, the development of the industrialization, applied science, the realization that these scientific concepts can be turned into technological advancements. That's probably the biggest driving force, again, because people want to make money off this sort of thing. I say all that to say that we are being presented with a very simplistic view of history, and simplistic explanations within historical narratives are almost never true, just because history is immensely complicated. All right, well, I hope that you enjoyed that brief breakdown, or if there's some other videos related to the history or philosophy of science that you think are interesting and that you would like for me to review. Again, please send those to me, and I will see you all next time.